Am I the bad one for wanting to take my daughter back to my home country after my residency was denied, even though her father refuses to give permission for her to leave? Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I'm 30 years old and the mother of a little girl. Her father is 32 years old and was the man I thought I'd build my whole life with, although things ended in a way I never imagined. Now I find myself in a situation where I legally can't move forward in the country where I live, and at the same time, I can't return to the place I always considered my home because my ex refuses to give consent for our daughter to travel with me. A few years ago, I came to this country on a 3-year work visa. The company I worked for needed custom work, and I accepted the offer because it represented an excellent professional and financial opportunity. From the first moment, it was clear to me that my stay would be temporary, as I always planned to return to my country once the contract ended. My family, my friends, and practically my whole life were there, so I never considered settling permanently abroad. The first few months were difficult because adapting to a different culture is never easy. I missed the food, the customs, hearing my language on every corner, and, above all, the closeness of my family. However, little by little I began to feel more comfortable. I made friends at work and learned to get by in a completely new environment. It was precisely during that time that I met Joseph, and everything began to change in a way that seemed wonderful to me then. Joseph was attentive, polite, and extremely patient. He was always willing to help me when I had problems with some paperwork or when I just felt lonely. He made me believe I could fully trust him, and honestly, for a long time I thought I had been incredibly lucky to meet him. All my colleagues said he was a good man, and I had no reason to think otherwise. So our relationship progressed quite naturally. As the months went by, we started talking about the future. I constantly repeated to him that when my contract ended I'd return to my country because I had never planned to stay forever. He always answered that he didn't want to lose me and that he'd do everything possible to convince me to build a life together in that country. At that time, his words seemed romantic to me and I interpreted them as a demonstration of love. Although now, looking back, I wonder if I was simply ignoring many signs I preferred not to see. After almost 2 years of relationship, Joseph asked me to marry him. He prepared a dinner, organized everything very carefully, and ended up kneeling in front of me to make the proposal. I accepted without hesitation because I truly believed I was with the best man I had ever met in my life. I immediately called my parents to give them the news, and although they were saddened to think that I would probably live so far away from them, they told me that the important thing was for me to be happy. A few months later, I discovered I was pregnant. We were both very excited and decided to postpone the wedding because we thought it was more practical to concentrate first on the birth of our daughter. We started preparing a room for the baby. We bought clothes, furniture, and everything necessary. I imagined I was forming the family I had always wanted to have, and I never thought everything could crumble so quickly. When I was in my 5th month of pregnancy, something happened that changed absolutely everything. Joseph left his phone on the table while he went to take a shower, and a series of notifications began to arrive. I didn't have the habit of checking other people's cell phones, but the name of the same woman appeared several times in a matter of minutes, and that aroused my suspicions. I know many people will say that invading privacy is wrong, and they're probably right, but if I hadn't looked at that phone, I would have continued living a lie for much longer. What I found were conversations that left no room for interpretation. There were romantic messages, photographs, plans to see each other, and even references to encounters they had had while I was already pregnant. I felt like the ground disappeared from under my feet because until that moment I had never suspected infidelity. When I confronted him, he tried to say it wasn't important. Then he assured me it had just been a mistake, and finally he ended up blaming me for checking his phone instead of taking responsibility for what he had done. That same weekend I packed my things and left the apartment. I didn't want to continue living under the same roof with someone who had betrayed my trust at the moment I was most vulnerable. I got a small apartment near my work, and although it was a great financial effort, I preferred to face that situation alone rather than continue pretending that everything was fine. My pregnancy continued between medical appointments, work days, and many tears that I tried to hide from everyone. As if all that wasn't enough, my visa was about to expire. I thought I would have to return pregnant to my country ahead of schedule, but the company decided to renew my contract for 2 more years. That news gave me enormous relief because it meant I could keep my job, have financial stability, and calmly prepare for the arrival of my daughter, while I began the process of obtaining permanent residency. My daughter was born healthy, and from the first moment I knew she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. However, I was also clear that I didn't want to depend on Joseph for absolutely everything. My intention was for her to have only my last name, because he had decided to break our family even before she was born. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted to raise her without such an unstable person being able to constantly interfere in our lives. Joseph didn't agree and filed a lawsuit to legally recognize paternity. Finally, the court ruled in his favor because, obviously, he was the biological father. Since then, he pays child support and has a visitation schedule that consists of 2 weekends a month. I must admit that during those days he does comply with picking her up and returning her at the established time, so I've never had problems related to visits or child support payments. Meanwhile, I continued trying to obtain permanent residency because my intention was to give my daughter stability. I gathered documents, paid lawyers, submitted forms, and complied with all the requirements they indicated. However, every time a new administrative inconvenience appeared, and the process seemed to never move forward. After so many attempts, I finally received the official response. My application had been rejected because, according to the authorities, I didn't meet one of the necessary requirements to remain permanently in the country. I tried to appeal the decision, but the result was exactly the same. I consulted with another lawyer and he explained that the chances of reversing the refusal were extremely low. In other words, when my immigration status ended, I would no longer have a legal basis to continue living here. That news left me completely devastated because although I never planned to stay forever, now it wasn't just my life at stake, but also my daughter's. After thinking about it for weeks, I came to a conclusion that seemed to me the only reasonable option. Returning to my country meant being close to my parents, my siblings, and a whole support network that I simply don't have here. It also meant finding a job with the help of old contacts and raising my daughter surrounded by people who truly love her. It wasn't a decision made on a whim, but because I felt that staying here without a stable immigration status was much more irresponsible. The problem began when I spoke with Joseph. I explained the whole situation to him. I showed him the documentation about the refusal of my residency, and I told him I needed his authorization to travel with our daughter. I thought that even if the idea hurt him, he would understand that I wasn't choosing to leave because I wanted to take her away from him, but because I practically had no other alternative. His response was a resounding no. He told me he would never sign any document to allow our daughter to leave the country because he was convinced that once she arrived in my country, he would never see her again. I proposed daily video calls, full vacations with him, me assuming the flight costs, and even facilitating any reasonable agreement for him to maintain contact with our daughter, but he rejected absolutely all the options without even considering them. Now I'm completely blocked because, without his consent or a court order, I can't take my daughter out of the country. If I stay, I run the risk of losing my immigration stability and facing a very uncertain future. If I leave alone, I would have to abandon my daughter, something I would never do. I feel like I'm trapped between two impossible decisions and that any path will end up harming someone. So, I need a sincere opinion. Am I the bad one for wanting to return to my country with my daughter after being denied residency, even though her father refuses to give permission because he says he'd never see her again? Update 1. I want to thank you for all the comments you left on my previous post. I read many messages, even those that criticized me, because I needed to know if there was an alternative I hadn't considered. Several people recommended I go to social services before my permit to stay in the country ended, so I made an appointment with all the documentation I had. I went with the hope of finding a solution that would allow me to stay with my daughter, but I left there with more questions than answers. The social worker listened to my whole story without interrupting me. I explained that my permanent residency had been rejected, that I had already exhausted the appeals, and that the time I had left legally in the country was coming to an end. I also told her that Joseph flatly refused to sign any authorization for our daughter to leave with me to my home country. She reviewed all the documents very carefully, And when she finished, she told me she perfectly understood my desperation, but that the law was very clear in these cases. She explained that as long as the father had legally recognized the girl and fulfilled his responsibilities, no one could authorize me to take her out of the country without his consent or a court order. She recommended I hire a lawyer specializing in family law to try to get a judge to evaluate my situation, although she also warned that these types of processes could take too long and that there was no guarantee of obtaining a favorable response before my permit to stay there expired. I went directly from the building to a lawyer's office. I gave him absolutely all the documentation I had and asked him to initiate any possible procedure. However, his response was practically the same as social services. As long as Joseph continued to pay child support, attended the established visits, and there was no evidence of negligence or abuse, the chances of getting a judicial authorization to take the girl out of the country were very low. Still, we decided to try because I couldn't just stand by. The days began to pass too quickly, and every morning I woke up hoping to receive a call that would change everything. Every time we spoke with the lawyer, the answer was the same. We still had to wait. Meanwhile, Joseph continued to refuse to talk to me. I proposed sharing the travel expenses. I offered for our daughter to spend long periods with him during the holidays, and I even agreed to sign agreements where daily video calls were established. He rejected absolutely all the proposals without even stopping to analyze them. Finally, the day I most feared arrived. My permit to legally stay in that country had ended, and I no longer had any option to stay. I'll never forget that morning. I packed my daughter's little backpack with her favorite toys and several changes of clothes while trying to hold back my tears so as not to scare her. She was too young to understand why her mother was crying nonstop or why that day everything was different. When Joseph came to pick her up, I felt the world stop. I hugged her for a very long time. I kissed her forehead over and over again and tried to memorize every detail of her little face because I didn't know when I would see her again. She just kept repeating that she wanted to come with me, without understanding that legally, that no longer depended on me. Seeing her walk away in her father's arms was, without a doubt, the most painful moment of my entire life. I returned to my country alone, completely heartbroken. My family tried to welcome me with joy to make the return less difficult, but everyone ended up crying when they realized I had come back without my daughter. The house felt empty and silent. Every night I wondered if she had eaten well, if she was sleeping peacefully, or if she asked for me when she woke up. I never imagined that the physical pain of missing a child could feel that way. I didn't waste any time and started contacting lawyers both in my country and abroad. I sent them all the documentation so they could review the case again, looking for any possibility the previous ones might have overlooked. Unfortunately, they all agreed on the same thing. Joseph was fulfilling all his legal obligations. He paid child support on time, took the girl to her medical checkups when it was his turn, and there was no breach that would allow his capacity as a father to be questioned before a judge. I was only allowed to travel for a few days a year to see my daughter, and that made the situation even more desperate. Every video call ended with me crying for hours because I saw how she continued to grow, while I could only be with her from a phone screen. I tried to find a new job that would sponsor another visa to return. I sent out resumes practically every day and participated in interviews, but no company wanted to take on the immigration process. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into an endless wait. During all that time, the lawyers kept telling me there was no progress, and that as long as Joseph continued to act as a responsible father, the court would hardly change the situation. I was beginning to feel like I was fighting against a wall that was never going to move. Finally, after a very long time, I was able to re-enter the country as a visitor for just 2 weeks. I bought the ticket as soon as I had the money because I couldn't stand being away from my daughter any longer. When I arrived at Joseph's house, I expected an uncomfortable conversation or some argument, but something happened that caught my attention. Joseph opened the door with an evident look of exhaustion. He had very dark circles under his eyes. The house was quite messy, and he barely greeted me. My daughter ran towards me as soon as she saw me, and he practically handed her to me in his arms before saying he would be back when my visit days were over. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to stay for a few minutes, nor did he want to talk. He simply left with an expression that reflected a tiredness I had never seen on him before. During those 2 weeks, I enjoyed every second with my daughter. She slept hugging me. She wanted me to accompany her everywhere, and she seemed to be afraid of being separated even for just a few minutes. However, I also began to notice small comments from people close to Joseph. A neighbor told me that he had been looking exhausted for some time because raising a little girl alone was much more difficult than he had imagined. She even commented that she had seen him ask his parents for help several times because he said he barely had time to rest or go out. Another person we knew in common told me something similar. According to her, Joseph constantly complained about how complicated it was to organize his work with the care of the child and repeated that he never thought being a full-time father was so demanding. The funny thing was that even though he was clearly overwhelmed by the situation, he still flatly refused to talk about the possibility of our daughter living with me when my 2 weeks were about to end. I reviewed my financial situation and understood that I could no longer continue paying lawyers in 2 different countries. I had spent practically all my savings trying to resolve a process that seemed to be making no progress at all. Continuing down that path only meant getting into more debt without getting results. With a completely broken heart, I called my lawyers and asked them to prepare all the necessary documentation for Joseph to obtain full custody of our daughter. It hurt me to even say those words, but I felt it was the most responsible decision legally. I was still the main person responsible for a child I couldn't live with, and I didn't want that uncertainty to end up harming her in the future. Signing those documents was one of the most devastating experiences of my life. I felt like I was failing her as a mother, although at the same time I knew I was trying to give her the most stability possible within a situation I never chose. I hugged my daughter for hours before saying goodbye and promised I would never stop looking for a way to be with her again. Then I returned to my country with a shattered heart, convinced that I had made the most difficult decision a mother can ever make. Update 2. I didn't think I would write again so soon because, honestly, after returning to my country, I felt I no longer had the strength to keep fighting. I had signed the documents for Joseph to obtain full guardianship of our daughter, and I was convinced that this was the end of this story. I spent several days unable to sleep, wondering if my daughter would ever understand why I had made such a painful decision. I felt like I had failed as a mother, although everyone around me insisted I had done the only thing I could do, given the circumstances. Just a few days after returning, I received a call from my lawyer. I answered thinking that some document was missing or that there was a problem with the process, but from the moment I heard his tone of voice, I knew something completely unexpected was happening. The first thing he told me was to sit down because the news was going to change absolutely everything. I felt my heart race as I waited for him to continue speaking. He explained that as soon as Joseph officially received full guardianship of our daughter, he had immediately called his office. According to my lawyer, Joseph was very upset and said he no longer wanted to take care of the child, that he was willing to return guardianship to me, and that he would also sign the necessary authorization for our daughter to leave the country and live with me. My lawyer even asked him several times if he was completely sure because such a drastic change just a few hours after obtaining custody was very strange. But Joseph insisted he wanted to resolve everything as soon as possible. I couldn't hold back the tears when I heard those words. For so long I had prepared myself to live separated from my daughter that my mind took several minutes to understand what was happening. The only thing I repeated over and over was whether this was real or if there was a possibility he would change his mind. My lawyer told me we had to act quickly precisely to avoid that, so he began to prepare all the necessary documentation to formalize the change before Joseph could regret it. The following days were a whirlwind of calls, signatures, documents, and procedures between both countries. My lawyer worked practically without rest to speed up each procedure, while I gathered everything necessary to receive my daughter again. I didn't want to get my hopes up too much because after everything that had happened, I was afraid something would go wrong at the last moment. However, this time every document was approved and every step brought us a little closer to the reunion. When everything was finally ready, Joseph kept his promise. He signed the authorization for our daughter to travel with me and agreed to return legal guardianship to me without raising any objections. My lawyer coordinated the entire procedure and organized the girls' trip following the established protocols for minors traveling internationally. I never imagined that an airport could become the place where I would feel my life was starting over again. I still remember the moment I saw my daughter come out accompanied by the airline staff. I ran towards her without caring who was watching and hugged her with all my strength. She started crying as soon as she saw me and kept repeating that she didn't want to be separated from me again. I couldn't answer her because the tears wouldn't let me speak. We remained hugging for a very long time while people passed around us. That was without a doubt the most important hug of my entire life. The first few days were a mixture of happiness and sadness. Happiness because we were finally together again, and I could put her to bed every night, prepare her breakfast, and listen to her laugh without depending on a video call. Sadness because I couldn't stop wondering how it was possible that Joseph had changed his mind so quickly after fighting for so long to prevent our daughter from leaving the country. Nothing made sense, and although I tried to concentrate on enjoying my little one, that question kept going around in my head. The answer came when I least expected it. A friend that Joseph and I had in common wrote to me on social media. We hadn't spoken for a long time, so I thought she just wanted to know how I was. However, she asked me to call her because there was something she needed to tell me, and she said she couldn't keep silent any longer after everything that had happened. During that call, she told me things that even today I find hard to believe. According to her, Joseph never expected me to agree to be separated from our daughter. He was convinced that when the time came to choose between returning to my country or staying with the child, I would end up giving in and come back to him to keep the family together. He said in front of several people that I would never be able to stand being away from my daughter, and that sooner or later I would show up at his door begging for another chance. My friend even remembered conversations in which Joseph said that our daughter was the only link that still tied me to him, and that thanks to that, he would manage to get me to come back. In his own words, he was convinced that I would end up accepting any condition in order not to lose our daughter. He never talked about love, about regret, or about wanting to repair the damage he had done to me. Everything revolved around proving that he could force me to come back. When he finally saw that I returned to my country instead of begging him, he started to get nervous. My friend told me that during those days Joseph constantly repeated that I would surely come back very soon because no mother could bear to live far from her daughter. He was completely sure it was just a matter of waiting a little longer for me to show up looking for him. But everything changed when I returned to the country to see my daughter, and instead of asking him to come back with me, I started the process to give him full guardianship. According to my friend, Joseph was completely paralyzed when he received the notification. He expected tears, pleas, and promises of reconciliation, but he was met with documents where I legally accepted that he be the sole guardian of our daughter because I understood that it was the best for her given the circumstances. She told me that on that same day he panicked. He started repeating that this couldn't be happening, that I was reacting in a completely different way than he had imagined. In his words, Joseph realized too late that being a full-time father was much more difficult than he had thought, and that he had used our daughter as if she were a piece in a game to manipulate me. My friend also confessed to me that he felt deeply disappointed because I never went looking for him. He said he didn't understand how it was possible that I had preferred to leave rather than go back to him. Hearing that produced a mixture of anger and sadness that is difficult to explain. During all that time, I blamed myself for not finding a solution. While he waited for our daughter's suffering to be enough to force me back into a relationship that he himself destroyed with his infidelity. The worst of all was understanding that my daughter had been used as a tool to try to control my life. She went through months of separation, confusion, and sadness because her father believed he could manipulate my decisions using the love I feel for her. He never thought about what it meant for a child to be away from her mother. He never considered the emotional damage it could cause her. Everything revolved around his pride and proving that he still had power over me. Reading and hearing all that destroyed me inside. For a long time, I thought he was simply acting like a father who didn't want to be separated from his daughter, something that although it hurt me, I could come to understand. But I discovered that behind everything there was a plan to make me come back with the change completely my way of seeing what happened. My daughter suffered unnecessarily because of the immaturity, selfishness, and absurd need for control of a man who preferred to play with his own daughter's life rather than accept that our relationship was over forever. Now my life revolves completely around my daughter and recovering all the time that was taken from us. Little by little, we've been building a new routine in my country. She has already started to adapt. She's made new friends, and she smiles again with the peace of mind of knowing that every morning she will wake up in the same house as her mom. There are still moments when she clings to me for fear that I'll leave again. And every time that happens, I hug her with all my strength and promise her that I will do everything in my power so that we never go through a separation like the one we experienced again. It's a slow process, but seeing her happy again makes all the suffering worthwhile. Many people have asked me if I plan to sue Joseph for everything he did, but the reality is that I don't have enough evidence. The only thing that exists is the testimony of our mutual friend. And any lawyer I consulted explained that starting a new process would mean investing a lot of money without any guarantee of obtaining a favorable result. After so many years spending my savings on lawyers and procedures, I no longer want to continue living in courts or allow him to continue occupying space in my life. I prefer to dedicate that time, that money, and that energy to my daughter because in the end she is with me, and that's the only thing that really matters. My peace and the stability of my little one are worth much more than any legal battle that would probably not give us back anything we lost. Story 2. I threw away my daughter's late father's letters, called her a thief without proof, and chose my stepdaughter's lies the night she crashed in the rain. Was I wrong? Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I threw the box of letters in the trash while she was in class. I didn't even hesitate. I walked down the stairs with the lid open. I saw the folded photos, the movie tickets, the notes she wrote to Clara when he was still alive, and felt that old, thick irritation, like accumulated dust. I closed the black bag and left it next to the dumpster. It was fast, clean, almost efficient. I accused her of stealing without listening to her. Hours later, she was unconscious under hospital lights. If I put it like that, it sounds like everything happened in a single day, but no. It was a sum of small, repeated, almost automatic decisions. I'm Laura, I'm 45 years old. Clara is 16. Sophia, my stepdaughter, is 17. And everything blew up the night I blamed Clara for missing money. We argued. And it ended in a car accident in the rain. After my husband died, something in me hardened. It wasn't immediate. It was more like a door slowly closing, without noise. Clara, on the other hand, clung to every memory of him as if they were life preservers. She kept everything in a box under her bed. Photos, letters, worthless receipts. I called it trash from the past. It irritated me to see her cry over old papers. It made me feel trapped in something I wanted to bury. When I remarried, Sophia arrived with a different energy. She smiled easily. She looked at me as if I were enough. One afternoon she told me, "You're the best mother I've ever had." And something in me settled. I needed to hear that. I needed to feel that someone didn't compare me to the memory of a dead man. I started with small details. If there was a budget for an extra activity, it was for Sophia. If school events coincided, I went to hers. I told myself that Clara would understand, that she was more mature, that she didn't make a drama. Clara didn't protest at first. She just drew more. She drew empty tables, crooked houses, figures with their mouths closed. I made her room smaller to enlarge her sister's. I told her it was temporary. I gave away her dog because Sophia wanted it more. Clara didn't yell that time. She just left her plate untouched and went to her room. That silence started to bother me more than any argument. It was as if she were judging me without speaking. At family gatherings, I compared their grades, their attitude, their way of dressing. "Look how hard your sister tries," I said, smiling, as if it were motivation. Clara would look down. Sophia would squeeze my hand under the table. The day I threw away the memory box, Clara came back from school and went straight to her room. I heard the dull thud of the empty drawer. She came down the stairs with swollen eyes. "Where are my things?" "I threw them away. Get over it. You can't live anchored." She screamed as if someone had died again, and I stood firm. I convinced myself I was helping her. The money disappeared weeks later. It was missing from my purse. It wasn't a fortune, but enough to ignite something in me. Sophia said she saw Clara nearby. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't check anything. I didn't take a breath before speaking. I called her into the kitchen. Return it right now. Clara shook her head, trembling. It wasn't me. I told her she was a liar, that nobody was going to love her with that attitude, that she was ungrateful, that she always caused problems. The words came out like blades. Damn, I don't remember everything I said, but I do remember her face. She didn't cry. She just blinked faster. She went up to her room and closed the door. Hours later, she came down with a backpack. She said she was going to study with a friend. It was raining hard. The sound against the windows was insistent, almost annoying. I didn't stop her. And that was the last time I saw her conscious in my house. The rain didn't stop all night. It hit the roof as if someone were throwing small stones constantly. I tried to distract myself. I washed the dishes twice. I checked my purse again, as if the money would appear by magic and so everything would be solved without me having to admit anything. Sophia was on the couch with her phone in her hand, calm, too calm. At 11 I thought about texting Clara. I didn't. I told myself she always exaggerated, that she needed a scare to understand boundaries. I used that word boundaries a lot lately. It sounded adult, responsible, as if I were building character instead of breaking it. The call came past midnight. An unknown number, a professional voice, crash at an intersection, hydroplaning, ambulance, miracle. I remember saying, I'm on my way, without recognizing my own voice. The drive to the hospital was blurry, but the rain was still there, persistent, as if it didn't want me to forget anything. Sophia came with me. She didn't cry. She hugged me with calculated strength. Or maybe I think that now. In the ER, everything was white and noisy. Monitors, quick steps, questions I didn't hear fully. When I finally saw her, Clara was covered in bruises, with a bandaged forehead and closed eyes, so small, so still. For a second, I thought I'd lost her. And it wasn't a dramatic thought. It was physical, a hole in my stomach, as if someone had emptied something I took for granted. I sat down, I waited. Time in a hospital doesn't move forward, it stretches. Sophia asked for water. I lent her my purse so she could take out her wallet. I don't know why, but when she returned to the bathroom, she left her phone on the chair. The screen lit up with a notification. I don't usually check other people's things that night. Yes, maybe it was intuition, maybe it was guilt or fear. I opened the chat. I took the money. She always falls for it. Provoke her, and you'll see. I felt cold. Not air conditioning cold, but one that goes up your back and leaves you stiff. I kept reading. Laughs. Comments about how easy it was to steer the conversation toward Clara, about how I reacted without hesitation. There it was, black on white. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't perception. It was intention. When Sophia came back, I already had the phone in my hand. She looked first into my eyes, then at the screen. She knew. I took her into the hallway. I didn't yell. I couldn't. Did you steal? She broke down, crying almost immediately. She covered her face. She said it was a joke that got out of hand. That Clara dramatized everything, that she just wanted me to listen to her, for me to realize how hard it was to compete with a ghost, that my husband's shadow was always in the middle, that I never saw what she did right because Clara hogged all the pain. The word ghost stuck with me. I thought of the box of letters, the photos, the trash, Clara screaming as if someone had died again. Sophia was trembling. She told me she was afraid of losing me, that she needed to know I'd choose her. That word again, and I chose to believe her again. I didn't go to the doctor to report anything. I didn't call my sister. I didn't read the messages in front of her again. I put the phone in my purse and went back to the waiting room as if nothing had happened, as if that conversation hadn't shifted the axis of my house. I convinced myself she was a confused teenager, that it had been an impulsive mistake, that Clara also bore responsibility for causing constant tension with her distant attitude. When the doctor came out to say Clara was stable, I felt relief, a relief so great it almost erased everything else. I clung to that. She's alive. That's the important thing. I repeated to myself. I went in to see her when she opened her eyes for the first time. She didn't look at me. She looked at the wall behind me. "Can you ask Aunt Marta to come?" she said in a low, raspy voice. She didn't mention the money. She didn't ask about Sophia. She didn't confront me about anything. She just asked for my sister. That silence was different from before. It wasn't restrained. It was definitive. Marta arrived at dawn. She greeted me without reproaches, but her gaze lingered a second longer than normal on my face, as if she were looking for something or as if she already knew. The following days were a mix of medical reports, forms, and brief visits. Clara barely spoke when I was in the room. If Sophia came in, she closed her eyes. I tried to justify everything inside my head. The accident was the rain, the money was a foolish thing. The words I said to her, well, everyone says things they don't mean when they're angry. That's what I thought. That's what I repeated. But every time I remembered the message, she always falls for it. Something moved inside me, and still I didn't do anything. When she was discharged, Clara didn't want to come home. She said it with the same calmness with which she had asked for Marta, without drama, without yelling. She left with a backpack and a small bag. She didn't take drawings, she didn't take memories. I watched her leave and told myself it was temporary, that she'd get over it, that she'd understand. Sophia hugged me that night. She told me everything would be fine, that now we could start over, without constant tension. The house was silent, and for the first time that silence didn't bother me. It scared me. The house was too tidy after Clara left. There were no slammed doors, no threats, no dramatic phrases I could use to convince myself it was just a phase, just her made bed and an empty space where her desk full of papers used to be. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway, as if waiting for her to appear with that walk of hers, hunched over, almost apologizing for taking up space. I told myself it was temporary, that she needed distance, that Marta was influencing her. It's funny how the mind finds external culprits when it doesn't want to look inward. Sophia took up more space without me asking her to. She'd sit next to me on the couch, cook with me, talk to me about colleges, about opportunities in another city. She said she wanted a big future, that she didn't plan on staying stuck. And every time I called her strong, independent, I felt I was doing something right, but there was something that didn't quite fit. Small details, random comments. Once I heard her laughing alone in her room while texting. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was lower, more private. I thought about the hospital. I thought about the phrase, "She always falls for it." I checked it again. That conversation was still there, intact. Sometimes I'd open the chat like someone touching a wound to check if it still hurts. I didn't delete it. I didn't confront it. I just let it exist in silence. Just like I let Clara's silence exist for years. I tried to call her a couple of times. She didn't answer. I wrote her something neutral.
"How are you?
Let me know if you need anything." There was no answer. Marta told me she was focused on recovering, that she needed peace. Her tone was polite, but firm, as if she were building a polite wall between us. I started thinking about what I told her that night. Nobody is going to love you with that attitude. The phrase would pop into my head when I least expected it, while washing dishes, while doing my makeup, while Sophia talked nonstop about her bright future. And I wondered if Clara believed her, if she'd kept it like she kept her father's letters. Sometimes I'd justify everything again. Clara was always sensitive, dramatic. She clung to the past. I was just trying to push her forward. That's what I told myself. But then I'd remember the scream when she discovered the empty box. That sound wasn't a whim, it was loss. There's something uncomfortable about admitting a daughter can become a mirror. Clara reminded me of the man who died. She reminded me that I couldn't handle that grief without breaking. Sophia, on the other hand, offered me the present. She offered me clean admiration, without shadows. I chose the easy light, even if it was artificial. Not everything was immediate after the hospital. There were weeks of a strange routine. Me working, Sophia going out more. Coming home late some nights. She said she was celebrating opportunities, farewells, plans. I didn't ask too much. It seemed unfair to start distrusting just when we were trying to rebuild something. One day I noticed some jewelry missing from the drawer. Small things, nothing exaggerated. I thought I'd moved them. I didn't want to check cameras or ask uncomfortable questions. I felt ridiculous, even for suspecting. I told myself I was paranoid because of the previous money issue, that I couldn't live seeing betrayals around every corner, but the doubt settled in not as a scream, but as a constant murmur. I reread the full messages again, not just the part about the money. There were more comments about how I reacted when Clara cried, about how easy it was to present herself as a strategic victim. That phrase wasn't written exactly like that, but the meaning was clear. She knew exactly which strings to pull. She knew I wanted to feel needed. And then I understood something that made me more uncomfortable than any theft. It wasn't just calculated teenage manipulation. It was that I had built the perfect stage for it to work. I needed to believe her. I needed someone to choose me without reproaches. Sophia just did what she did best in that environment. Sometimes I found myself thinking about the accident as if it were a pause, as if the crash had been an interruption forcing me to look at what I'd been ignoring. And a specific idea scared me, one I didn't say out loud even when I was alone. Maybe the accident wasn't just the rain. That night, before sleeping, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand. I looked at the photo of Clara in my gallery, an old one where she smiled without forcing anything before I started comparing her to anyone. I tried to remember when was the last time I hugged her unconditionally. I didn't know. Sophia announced weeks later that she'd gotten an opportunity in another city. She spoke fast, excited. She said it was the best thing for her growth. She hugged me tight. She thanked me for everything, for believing in her, for supporting her when nobody else did. That phrase pierced me. When she left, the house fell silent again, but this time it was different. There was no expectation of an immediate return. There were no promises of shared weekends, just enlarged rooms that now felt too big. I checked the drawer again. The jewelry didn't turn up. I sat in the kitchen alone with the phone in front of me. I opened the chat for the last time. She always falls for it. I no longer read it as a mockery toward Clara. I read it as a diagnosis. I always fell for it, and the worst part is that in the hospital, I already knew it. I knew it in the hallway when I confronted her. I knew that if I chose silence, I was signing off on something that couldn't be undone. I did it anyway, not out of love, not out of protection. I did it because facing the truth meant admitting that for years I had been unfair, and that weighed more than any message on a screen. Now the house breathes differently, without drawings on the table, without calculated laughs, just an echo. And for the first time, I don't have anyone to choose. The news that Sophia was leaving came as a promise and a goodbye at the same time. I wanted to see it as growth, as success, as proof that I'd done something right. I helped her pack. I folded her clothes carefully, as if that gesture could hold onto what was leaving. She hugged me before walking out, quick, firm. She told me she'd call me as soon as she arrived, that all this was thanks to me. That phrase settled right back into the exact place where I always let it in. When I closed the door, the house made a strange noise, not physical, more internal, as if something had given way. The first few days I waited for her call. It didn't come. I texted her. She took a long time to reply, short excuses, lots to do. New friends, opportunities that couldn't wait. I tried not to read distance where maybe there was only enthusiasm. One afternoon, I opened the jewelry drawer again. It was no longer a mild suspicion. It was a certainty. More things were missing. I checked other places. An envelope with cash I kept for emergencies wasn't there either. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by open drawers. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just felt something very simple and very clear. I had chosen again. I called Sophia. She didn't answer. I texted her asking directly about the money and the jewelry. Her answer came hours later, ambiguous, even offensive. She said I was exaggerating, that I always saw ghosts where I didn't know it. That word again. The confrontation was brief and cold. No tears this time, no emotional explanation, just distance. I hung up and stared at the wall in front of me. I thought about the hospital hallway. I thought about Clara with her eyes closed. I thought about the piece of paper she left on the bed when she went to Marta's house. I'm not trash. That sentence had no exclamation marks, no insults. It was almost calm, and that's why it hurt more. I decided to call Marta. Not to accuse, not to defend myself, just to listen. Her voice was firm, as always. She told me Clara was better, that she was drawing again, that she had started therapy, that she didn't want contact with me for now. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to intervene. I didn't try to justify anything. For the first time, I didn't have arguments ready. I hung up and stayed in the kitchen leaning against the counter. I remembered every comparison at family dinners. Every time I said, "Look how hard your sister tries." Every time I used one's admiration to pressure the other, I told myself I was creating healthy competition. In reality, I was building abandonment. The consequence was no longer abstract, it was concrete. One daughter who wasn't talking to me, another who had used me and disappeared, an enlarged house that now felt hollow. I realized something uncomfortable. The accident hadn't been the peak of the damage. It was just the visible moment. The real damage was cumulative, constant, repeated. I chose every time I minimized her tears, every time I dismissed her pain as drama, every time I called her memories trash. The punishment didn't come with screams, it came with absence. I tried to write Clara something more honest. Not a "how are you," not a neutral message. I wrote and deleted for hours. The words didn't fit. It all sounded like an excuse, a late defense, a fear of being left alone more than love, because if I'm brutally honest, a part of me still wanted to be seen as the strong mother, the one who doesn't make mistakes. Admitting destructive parental favoritism meant admitting that I had been the source of the problem, not the solution. Weeks passed and news from Sofia. The bank confirmed transactions I didn't recognize. They weren't huge, but they were enough for the story to close with cruel logic. I didn't report her again. I didn't ask myself if that repeated silence was cowardice or habit. Maybe you love. One night, I walked to Clara's downsized room. I touched the wall where her bookshelf used to be, closed my eyes, and tried to mentally reconstruct the box of letters I threw away. I couldn't remember all the photos. I couldn't remember every detail. Memory doesn't return what you intentionally discard. I understood something late. I wanted to erase Clara's grief because mine made me uncomfortable. Instead of accompanying her, I competed with a ghost and lost to something that wasn't alive. The loss was no longer potential. It was definitive. Clara didn't come back after she was discharged. Sofia didn't come back after her opportunity in another city. There was no final dramatic scene, just decisions linking together until there was nothing left to choose. I sat in the middle of the living room, looking at the two closed doors. I thought about the question I'd been avoiding since the hospital. Does seeking validation in one child justify emotionally destroying the other? The answer didn't come in words. It came with an echo, and that echo was the only thing that answered. Over time, the house stopped looking freshly abandoned and started looking old, not because of the furniture, but because of the air. An air that doesn't move because there's no one to disturb it. I used to complain about the noise, the slammed doors, the arguments. Now I'd give anything to hear Clara drawing at the table or Sofia laughing from her room. Clara didn't come back. There was no dramatic reconciliation or uncomfortable dinner where everything is said through tears. There was distance, silence. Marta sends me messages very occasionally to tell me she's stable, that she's studying, that she's still in therapy. She doesn't add more. I don't ask too much either. I don't want to force something she decided to cut off to survive. Sometimes I think the crash was the only time Clara stopped listening to me, that under those hospital lights, unconscious, she no longer had to endure my comparisons, my sharp phrases, my need for her to be different. Damn, that idea pierces me as if it were still raining. Sofia didn't come back either. Her replies became more and more spaced out until they ceased to exist. I discovered more transactions in my account. They weren't huge, but they were enough to understand that the manipulation wasn't a teenage accident. It was a pattern, the same pattern I fed when I decided to look the other way. Sometimes I open the old chat and reread the phrase, "She always falls for it." Before I saw it as a mockery, now I see it as a warning I ignored. I always fell for it because I wanted to fall for it, because I preferred feeling admired over being fair, because facing the truth meant accepting that I had been cruel. I can't get the box of letters back. I can't unhear my own words. Nobody is going to love you with that attitude. That phrase follows me, like an echo that won't fade. Hell, I don't even know at what exact moment I started turning my own daughter into competition. I've tried to justify myself less. I no longer say it was for her own good. I no longer say I needed to toughen her up. What I needed was to not feel inadequate. And in that search, I ended up being exactly that. The punishment wasn't immediate or loud. It was slow. It was built with every comparison, with every repeated public humiliation, with every convenient silence. Now there are no daughters to choose. There are no hugs to validate me. Just rooms enlarged for someone who isn't there. Sometimes I wonder if guilt is worth anything when it arrives late. If acknowledging destructive parental favoritism changes anything when the abandonment is already irreversible. If the unresolved grief I tried to hide behind verbal authority was the real beginning of it all. I always chose, and now I'm left with no choices. If I choose poorly for years and only realize it when I'm left alone, is guilt worth anything? Popular comments. Anonymous comment 1. It wasn't just the accident, it was everything that came before. Throwing away her father's memories already marked a limit. There are things that can't be undone. OP's reply. That decision was a line I never should have crossed, and I did it coldly. Anonymous comment 2. It hurts to read how you normalize the comparisons. Sometimes a child's silence is exhaustion, not rebellion. OP's reply. Her silence was exhaustion, and I interpreted it as defiance. That weighs on me. Anonymous comment 3. The thing with the messages was clear proof. And still you decided to protect the one who manipulated you. OP's reply. I chose silence in that hallway. That choice changed everything. Anonymous comment 4. Clara asked for your sister, not you. That says a lot without the need for screaming. OP's reply. Yes, it was the clearest way to show me where I stood. Anonymous comment 5. Sometimes one seeks to be admired and forgets to be fair. That destroys more than any argument. OP's reply. I preferred to feel needed rather than face my mistakes. Now I see the cost. Anonymous comment 6. Sophia knew how to read your insecurities. But you were the adult in the room. OP's reply. That's the part one can't dodge. I should have set the boundary. Anonymous comment 7. Abandonment isn't always leaving screaming. Sometimes it's leaving in silence and not coming back. OP's reply. The silence was more definitive than any fight we had. Anonymous comment 8. The phrase you told her is devastating. There are words that stick forever. OP's reply. That phrase accompanies me every day. I can't erase it. Anonymous comment 9. Not reporting or confronting in time was also a decision, even if it hurts to see it that way. OP's reply. Yes. Doing nothing was doing something, and I did it more than once. Anonymous comment 10. Maybe the question isn't if guilt is useful, but what you'll do with it now. OP's reply. I still don't have a clear answer, and that scares me too.